Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today. I'm really excited to introduce you to this event. My name is Leah Keener. I'm Bay Nature's event coordinator. And thank you all for joining us this evening for the first Ask the Naturalist virtual hour. I encourage everyone here to please turn your cameras on and join us if you're able. It'd be great to just see your faces and connect with you that way. And thanks to you all for joining us again this evening. So before we begin, I just want to start by introducing Bay Nature. We are a quarterly print magazine, and we focus on nature and conservation topics that are local to the 9 counties of the Bay Area. And in addition, we also publish weekly online content and host some events like hikes and talks in this event today. And even though this is the first Ask the Naturalist hour, like live virtual hour, the Ask the Naturalist idea has been part of Bay Nature for more than 20 years. It's been a column in our magazine since, I think, 2002. And basically, guest naturalists from around the Bay have answered community questions that people have sent in. And that's been a column for 20 years in our magazine. So it's really exciting to bring that column to life through this virtual format, and I'm really excited to invite you all here today for the first of those events. So thank you so much for being here. So before we begin, I also just want to set some parameters for this event. It's really going to be based around the questions that you ask. So please, I encourage you to enter any questions you have into the chat or raise your hand using the Zoom raise hand function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. It should have a little button that says reactions. You can click on that reaction and it'll say like raise hand. And if you do that, you can just raise your hand and I'll call on you, or I'll call you from the audience, or I'll call you from the chat and like ask you or invite you to ask your question out loud. You can unmute and ask your question that way, or if you'd prefer, I can also ask your question. So up to you. But those are the two ways. So either through the chat or by raising your hand. And also, this is really just a place to be curious about nature. Any of the questions you've encountered while you've been outside or that you've thought about at any point, this is the time to ask them. We have two great guest naturalists here today, and I'm really excited for you to just be able to ask your questions to them. And please try to avoid asking questions that are like how to use iNaturalist questions. There's a lot of online resources for that, and I can send out some information about how to do that. But this is really just a place to be curious and ask your questions, and just don't hold back. So thank you all for being here today. Even if you've sent in questions ahead of time, please send them also here in the chat or raise your hand. I'm going to prioritize the questions that come in live, and I'll use the questions that got sent in before as like a stockpile for questions if we need more questions to draw from. But yeah, thank you all for being here. We may not get to everyone's questions depending on how many people submit, so we'll just see how it goes. But yeah, thank you all for being here. And I'd like to start by just introducing our guests. And I'm really excited they're here today. And thank you to them both for sharing their evening with us. First, I'll start by introducing Ken-ichi Ueda. Ken-ichi is the co-founder of the iNaturalist app and is an avid naturalist with a background in both biology and software development, and has worked as a wildlife technician, GIS and web developer, and he first developed iNaturalist in 2008 while pursuing a master's degree at UC Berkeley. And since then, it's now grown into a platform that has more than 3 million observers. So thank you, Ken-ichi, for being here. And then I'd also like to introduce Tony, who's also on iNat staff. Thank you so much, Tony, for being here. Tony is also an experienced interpretive naturalist and photographer and is a counselor. He also has been helping out with iNat's outreach support and community management since 2015. And while not at work, he enjoys looking for, but rarely finding reptiles and amphibians. So thank you for being here, Tony, as well. I really appreciate you all for being here. And with that, I'd like to kick us off and just start with a pretty open-ended question. And while I do that, those of you in the audience, please just drop your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you think of any questions, and I will call you after that. But for the first question, Ken-ichi and Tony, I just wanted to ask, how did you both first get into nature originally? And from then until now, it's probably been years. How have your nature observing habits changed? And what have you learned? What do you do differently? And what does a typical nature observing excursion look like for you now? Yeah.
You want to go first, Tony, or should I?
She said your name first.
Oh, okay. All right. Anyway, thanks, Leah, and thanks, By Nature, for
Yeah.
having us. It's really cool to be kicking this event series off. And yeah, looking forward to all these questions. Already seeing some cool questions in the chat, most of which I cannot answer. I can
Okay.
answer the personal question though. Let's see. How did I get into nature? I don't know if I ever did get into it. I have just always been into it, and
Mm.
like I can't not be that. Sometimes I wish I could, but no, I can't.
Yeah.
Um, things I do or did differently. I mean, like as a kid, I was lucky enough to grow up near some woodland, and I would spend a lot of time like running around there and looking for salamanders and getting poison ivy. So that hasn't changed in my naturalist practice. I still get poison ivy or poison oak pretty much all the time,
Mm.
and I still look for salamanders. But I think I'm a little more careful and more selective about what I do to look for things. So like as a kid, I would like turn over every log, and these days I'm like, I don't need to turn over that log. That's okay. I'll leave that habitat alone and save that for another person.
Mm. Thank
Tony?
you.
Yeah. So I grew up in Hawaii, and I think spiders are my gateway into nature, which I think is not usual for most people, but I have very strong memories of watching Charlotte's Web, the movie, and having my parents read the book to me. And when I was like maybe 5, I was visiting my grandma on the mainland in central Washington. I saw a giant garden spider web in her garden. I was helping her garden. And I noticed some big grasshoppers on a rose bush in front of it. And she told me the grasshoppers were bad for the rose bush. So I pulled the rose bush, um, branch back. I don't recommend people do this. Let it go, and the grasshopper flew into the spider web. The spider immediately, sensed it, wrapped it up, and like I was like, "Whoa, this is exactly what like I've been reading about, what I've seen in movies, and this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen." And yeah, from then on, I was like, nature is really cool. I kept spiders as pets. I would catch lizards. Growing up in Hawaii, I wasn't like as I got older, and then in college in Massachusetts, which is where Ken-ichi and I met, I that kind of took a back burner, but uh, I got more into it when I got back home and when I moved here to the Bay Area. One reason I moved to the Bay Area is because Ken-ichi was posting on his then blog that there are tarantulas that you can actually see here. And yeah, that was amazing.
There.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
And yeah, sorry, it's going on a little too long, but
That's good.
when I first really started getting to nature out here, I would really focus just on like snakes and lizards. There's no snakes in Hawaii, so they were always amazing to me. Now, you know, I'm kind of with Kenichi. I don't really want to bother them the way I used to. I don't think it's necessary for the most part, and yeah, much more into plants and much more into photography. And now that I'm 40 something, I am moving a lot slower than I used to as well.
Thank you. Well, that was great. Thank you both for sharing and for that introduction. And I think I'll just turn straight to the chat. So the first question that I see is from Bill. Bill, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, I live in Sonoma County, and I was just wondering if there's an update on the effort to restore kelp forests along the Sonoma coast.
Wish I had an answer for that, but
Yeah,
like you, I don't live in Sonoma, and I don't keep tabs
Mhm.
on what's happening on the Sonoma coast. But
yeah,
maybe
same here. I'm
our friends
sorry.
at Bay Nature would know better.
What's happening in the kelp forests right now? If any, Bill or anybody, can you provide some more context there?
Well, with um, all the sea urchins that have taken over, they've wiped out the kelp forests along the coast, and so and I know there's an effort underway to restore those forests, and I'm just
Mm.
wondering if what the latest is on that information.
Mm. Thank you. Well, I am not sure, but we can always look in the main nature archives too and see if there's something there. But let's see. That's a good question. And then let's see. Actually, let's jump to Lisa. Lisa, do you mind unmuting and um sharing your questions?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yes.
Just was wondering about the inspiration behind the creation of iNaturalist and what was required, technically to build it I guess the final question is, can we use all the data that it collects to look at trends and be the basis for research?
I guess I'll speak to origins. What inspired it? Well, social media, things like LiveJournal and Flickr and birding listservs and other things that I used to help myself learn about nature in California when I moved here in 2003. Just seemed like a natural fit. Also, Google Maps. Believe it or not, there was a time when there was no Google Maps. Some of us were alive then. Yeah, and when Google Maps came out, it was like, oh, wow, this is really easy to map stuff. So that kind of confluence of technologies, plus me moving to a totally new ecosystem and having to relearn things, was kind of where iNat came from. What was required technically, you know, some knowledge of web development and some time and a lot of coffee and a lot of arguments. I can give you a rundown of technologies if you want, but I'm guessing that's not what you're interested in.
Well, I guess I am interested a little bit of just the analytics behind it. Like
Sure.
how,
I mean,
how
it's a
do you
big
build it?
database. If you've ever used like Microsoft Access or MySQL or a database like that, it's basically a database like that with a web application built around it. So we use a database called PostgreSQL and a web application framework called Rails. And we just have a big old Rails app built around a database. And that's sort of the core of it. All of the things like the website that you use and the mobile apps that you use, those are kind of clients talking to that central application.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Well, I guess I can speak to trends real quickly. It definitely can be. There was, I think it was in 2019 when there was we had those crazy rains, especially in Southern California, and some of the Joshua trees and Mojave yuccas were blooming out of season, which is not good because you know, they need specific moths to be flying to pollinate them. And so a group, I think they looked at about 1,000 iNat observations of Mojave yucca and Joshua trees, noted whether they were flowering or not, noted the date, the location, the altitude, the temperature, and stuff like that, and tried to model it kind of as a proof of concept to see if they can determine when there could be another kind of off-season blooming. And you know, these are all kind of, and we're just kind of starting this thing. And there's lots of people, and this is way beyond my knowledge, but who are working on statistics to try and iron out some of the biases in iNat and other citizen science or committee science data, because you know they're quite biased, just because they're human driven, and they are mostly, you know, trailheads and things that people notice. But there are lots of things that people are doing. I just made a video of a Berkeley student, not really a trend, but he and his co-authors, they looked at historically redline areas in 4 cities in California and used iNat data because it's so precise to note the observations and just the overall biodiversity of areas that were redlined in the past, so we're sort of based on discrimination, and green line and what the biodiversity is like today. So there's just a lot of different uses that I think people are finding in iNat data. So, and the more you do it, the more observations we have, the more people can actually use it.
Thank you both, and thank you, Lisa, for your questions. Yeah, I think, let's see, we can jump to the question from Richard here, and I think we can make it even a little bit more broad. Richard, do you want to ask your question?
Well, I've been in my house for 40 years in North Berkeley. And I remember when I used to go walk the dog right after it rained, I would have to be really careful where I stepped. And I got so tired of bending down to pick the snails up off the concrete where they'd get smushed, or, you know, I would keep a little twig in my pocket to pick up the earthworms and put them back in the dirt. And now I don't see any, or virtually none. And it's been, I'm going to guess and say 15 years. I know the city also got rid of the raccoons that used to live around here. They went in the sewer system, and I don't know how they killed them all. But so, and I know from having done seismic retrofits that raccoons would take a bunch of snails into a crawl space and eat them. And I had this one job where the mud sills were literally covered in empty snail shells. But I don't see it. I don't see either of those species hardly at all. And I was wondering if that's true in the macro version in the Bay Area, or is it just a micro thing in my neighborhood or block or something?
You have slugs?
I don't see slugs anymore either, but we didn't have as many slugs. So
Like, I'm really curious if anyone else in this group like has experienced something like that, especially over a 40-year time scale. My guess, I see a ton of slugs in my yard, and I think a lot of us do after rains. Like, you could argue that things have gotten a little bit drier over the last 40 years, but I don't think that that's probably true over like the entire region to the extent that it would affect snails and earthworms. It could be that they were using some subsurface refugium where you live that either got filled in or is not as wet as it used to be. You know, something about the hydrology of your property might have changed, that makes it a little bit less favorable, especially in the dry months, for those kinds of soil dwelling organisms.
I mean, until a couple years ago, there was no, well, there was some construction, but that was only about 7 years ago next door. Yeah, it just baffled me because even in the front, they were just like all over the sidewalks and not just my property, but when I would go walking.
I'm sure there are some gardeners in this group who could probably give you some.
Yeah. I mean, if I dig, I'll still find some. But the rains used to flush them out.
There's someone named Helen in the chat Helen, do you want to unmute and say your comment about snails and slugs that you've seen?
I have a lot of snails and slugs in my yard, and also at my father-in-law's in South City. At one point, my husband, unfortunately, was flinging like handfuls of them over the fence. But yeah, but the only thing I noticed in my garden this year is that I really don't have a lot of pollinators. I used to see honeybees in the yard even last year, but this year I usually see about 2 to 5 bumblebees a day, and that's it. So I'm kind of concerned about that and wanted to see if any of you guys experienced that as well.
I have goldenrod, and I seem to have a lot of bees and butterflies and and some other plants that they like. So I haven't seen that. I was seeing a lot of dead bees maybe 5 or 7 years ago, but I don't see that anymore.
I'd say a lot of what pollinators you see in your yard is driven partially by what kind of plants you've got growing in your yard. So if you've made changes there, that might change like what is showing up or isn't. The other major thing that changes like what's going to show up is how you treat the ground and treat the dead plants that are around. A lot of bees and moths and other things will stay in the soil over winter, or they'll use stems of dead plants or detritus on the ground. So if something that they like isn't there, like maybe they like a certain kind of twig or a certain size of twig to make their overwinter refugium, and if that's not there anymore, then they might take off. I've been in my current place for 6 or 7 years at this point, and I've definitely noticed a change in composition of the pollinators, but not necessarily in abundance. I get plenty of honeybees and bumblebees, but I get fewer smaller native bees now than I did when I first moved in, which is interesting because I have way more native plants now than there were originally. I built all this great habitat and then they all went away. So it can be hard to say exactly like why these changes happen. But you could think about what you've got growing and how you manage the ground, especially when things are not blooming.
Yeah, I don't have a garden. I live in an apartment, but there are tons of actually native bees out right now. I see them every year this time of year, and tiny ones, and they're all in non-native flowers. They're loving them. So lots of honeybees and bumblebees as well.
Plant more fennel.
Huh?
Plant more fennel.
Yeah, but Kenichi is correct in that like they mostly nest in the ground, especially our native bees, or in stems. You could look online and buy like bee hotels, which are like a bunch of hollow tubes, or you can make your own. And certain bees, especially mason bees, will nest in those, and they'll be attracted to them. And I love bees. California has, I think, 1,600 species of native bees, and if you have a macro lens or maybe close-up binoculars, definitely take a look at them on flower because they're beautiful and they're just very diverse.
Thank you. Yeah. Let's see. I think Lynn, you're raising your hand. Do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Hi, thank you. I do, and I love iNaturalist, and I love the plants, and I think they, using that as a tool, you can use it as a resource for information gathering. So I love the native plants, and I love TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. I'm on the peninsula, and I find that I would like to be get training in that area. I'm non-native, and there's a lot going on, and so I'm reaching out to find out if you know of any programs online or locally that that I could join, or places where I might participate, again being non-native. And then the last comment was, I love Bay Nature as well, because I think a lot of the articles are starting to bring that wisdom in, and they're beautiful to see what people are doing in the community. But it would be cool to also bring that information, like here's programs or here's trainings, so that those of us that are interested, this is a way in. Because I spend a lot of time trying to gather that information, and it keeps changing. It's certainly a very dynamic kind of a environment. So those are my questions.
Unfortunately, I don't know any training in the Bay Area for traditional ecological knowledge. Do you, Kenichi?
There's a it's not, I think it's a version of the CalNet program that is run by Indigenous Californians, but it is intended for other Indigenous Californians. I'm not aware of any programs that are kind of targeted at people who are non-Indigenous. That doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means I don't know about them. There are plenty of books about Indigenous California history that you could read up on. And a lot of Indigenous groups have websites that have some interesting information, particularly like names of plants. I'm always into that. So I think there's a lot of self-educational opportunities, but if other folks in the group have recommendations for actual programming, I'd love to learn about them too.
Exactly.
I can't see the thing to say raise your hand, so I'm just jumping in. I hope that's okay.
That's okay. Yeah, go for it.
There on UC Berkeley campus, there's a Myers Center for Native American Issues. And I think they would be a great first step to contact. Let me just Google that for a second and get the guy's first name.
Lynn, if you don't already have a copy, Kat Anderson's Tending the Wild is a wonderful resource book, especially if you like plants. Highly recommend getting that.
Yeah.
Joseph A. Myers Center for Research on Native American Issues. And then there's another classic book called Tending the Wild that, I should have known. That would be of use to you as a place to begin.
Yeah. Just as we're working at Hidden Villa in Los Altos Hills, and she's going to be the speaker in September. So they have tickets available to help them out at Hidden Villa if people are interested in that.
Awesome. Thank you all for the community sourced resources. And the other one I could think of was like Sogorea Land Trust probably has a lot of resources mentioned in their website and things like that. But yeah, thank you all. And I see a question from Melissa, or Melissa, your hand is raised. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. My first question was Do you have any idea of how upwelling zones in the ocean might have been affected by climate change or any differences you've seen in the past year? If you have any idea.
You submitted this earlier, and like Tony and I were looking at this before this event. We're like, oh, we don't know anything about upwelling.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have any personal knowledge. I looked up a few papers briefly before the meeting, and then they mostly were saying like there's so much we don't know about the way all these systems interact in the ocean and the wind and the coast that it's trying to predict it anyway is going to be pretty difficult. I did find an article saying that there are certain areas of like South Africa that have kind of experienced some cold snaps from upwelling, which I think is pretty interesting. But people interviewed in it were skeptical that that was going to be a widespread phenomenon. But I think to me the main lesson is like this is just so complicated.
I also glanced at some abstracts, and most of them have they're all modeling papers, right? You know, they could make a big model based on what data you have now and guess. So take them all with a grain of salt. But a lot of them are sort of predicting more extreme effects. So a lot like other climate change effects. It's not going to go away necessarily, but it might be even more nutrients coming up from lower depths. But what effect that might have, TBD. But I'm not an oceanographer, nor am I a climate scientist. So definitely want to ask a real expert on that one.
Yeah, I appreciate the research though. Potentially more easier question is, do you know like any naturalist courses or programs for younger people, like that include high schooler age or college kids age?
I know the California Master Naturalist program is for all ages, so that's one potential resource. I think they have a new name, like California Environmental Steward Program or something like that.
Yeah. If you do an internet search for like California Master Naturalist, you'll find there are plenty of courses throughout the year, although some can be pretty expensive.
But there are often scholarships for them as well.
Yeah. I don't know of any other like one specifically for young people offhand. I would just, if you're interested in a certain area or certain taxon or something, I would just look at any sort of volunteer or any sort of organization and see if you can volunteer. Either that or maybe go to some of their volunteer days and kind of get to know people first. Be kind of the way into a lot of things if you're young.
Yeah. A lot of groups have, if not classes, then, you know, outings and excursions that they're super open to having people join. So yeah, Audubon, Feminist Bird Club,
Lichen Society?
The California Lichen Society, let's not forget them.
Awesome. Thank you all for your questions. And one question that I actually had was seasonally, like in the 4 seasons of the year here in the Bay Area, what are some things like each season that are like hallmarks of that season that you'll go and look for? Like right now it's summer. What season, like in summer, what is that the season for to look for? And then same for like fall, winter, and spring. Like what are the seasons of the Bay for you guys?
Dry plants right now is a good one to look for. Actually, for me, because I live in the East Bay and I used to work at Hayward Shoreline, I think of summer as like a turn season because there's like lease turns, Forster's turns, and right now the elegant turns in the East Bay. I go to like Middle Harbor Shoreline, or you can go to Crown Beach in Alameda or Hayward Shoreline. I'm sure there are places on the other side of the bay. I just don't get there very much. And terns will be nesting, and you'll see them. You'll see especially parents coming back with fish in their mouth, or they'll be fighting over fish. And it's a lot of fun. At least for me, I think they're one of my favorite birds. So I definitely think of summer as like turn season. Or if you're insane like Ken-ichi, you can wake up early and go tide pooling and the early summer tides.
Yeah,
Nice.
The solstices are the time to go tide pooling. Those are our most extreme tides. So those are going to be the lowest tides. So if you like looking for sea slugs and anemones and weird things in the ocean, those are the seasons to do that. Ironically, I just realized the other day, like that I always go tide pooling on Independence Day and the Super Bowl. Like I'm the most un-American like naturalist imaginable, but those are actually almost always good times to go tide pooling. They usually coincide with extreme tides. I actually think of now as like it's the beginning of tarweed season, Tony.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Come on, tarweeds. It's
Tarweeds, vinegar weed. Vinegar
tarweed.
weed is something I always like think about for like summer or late summer. And I think it's beautiful and smells, I think, interesting.
Yeah, a great smell. Pretty much from now through September or October is a good time for a lot of late blooming flowers like tarweeds.
Mm.
And for fall, I always think of tarantulas because that's when the males are out. And so if you're in, I think, especially East Bay Hills and Mount Diablo and Diablo Range, and even down to the south, and sometimes in the Santa Cruz Mountains at dusk, you can see males out. They leave their burrows and they never go back. They're out looking for females in their burrows, and they'll walk when it gets cooler, and you can often find them.
Cool. That matches the Halloween vibes, seems like. But what about like winter and spring?
I'll say that the first time it rains, like every year, Tony and I try to find rain beetles and fail.
What's a rain beetle? I haven't heard of that.
They're these beetles that live underground. They're pretty big. They're like a big June bug, and they're like super hairy. They look like they're wearing these like fur coats.
So I've been told. I've never seen one. So yeah.
Sorry, every first rain, I try to find a rain beetle for Tony and fail. But yeah, they live underground pretty much most of their lives, and they mate during the rain. Their like event, their seasonality is driven by the first rains. So once we get a soaking rain that really gets the ground wet down to maybe like half a meter, that's when they start emerging. So females will come up and like dig a burrow up to the surface, and they'll sit in the entrance of their burrow, and the males will just come out and buzz around and fly looking for females, often while it's raining, like in the rain. So if you want to find them, you need to go out and wander around in the rain at dawn or dusk and, be filled with hope.
So cool.
But they're cool looking. And it's weird to think of things flying in the rain, that's their game.
Yeah, that's the ideal.
Yeah, and I think in winter also, I mean, I just think of birds because a lot of them are migrating through or resident here, and fungi, which, whoa, sorry about the echo there. Yeah, you can look for fungi, popping up next to the trail, which I think is always kind of interesting, again, after the rain.
And honestly, like even in December, you can start thinking about plants again and go look for manzanitas. A lot of manzanitas are also rain triggered and will start flowering a month after the rains begin.
And since they're the only ones flowering usually, if there are any pollinators out, they are on the manzanita. So they're not all spread out. They're like, oh wait, this is flowering. I need to get on this. And so it's easy to look at, like find early bees that emerge early, which I always enjoy.
So
To
cool.
rewind to summer, which is often a challenging time for naturalists in the Bay Area, it's also a good time to go whale watching or pelagic birding. Late summer, there's often a lot of whale activity, and there's often good offshore birds during that time period. So if you don't get seasick.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's cool. Richard, I think your hand is raised. Did you have another question?
Oh, well, I just wanted to offer a couple resources to the woman who was curious about upwelling. The Marine Mammal Center has biologists, and they're so concerned with the whales and the seals and such, they would have all the data, and I think that would be a good place to begin to ask. And for kids volunteering and getting training, Wild Care in San Rafael, I think, has a program for kids. And I just saw another one. It might have been through Wild Care for kids. So that's all.
Oh, thank you for sharing. Yeah. Another just kind of general naturalist question is like, what advice would you have to people who are just starting, who are at the very beginning and everything is unfamiliar, but everything is new? And what would your advice be to those naturalists?
Boy, if you're totally new, I think most people when they go out, they probably have an interest in something. Like you know, like a lot of people maybe are interested only in birds at first, and then when they're out birding, they're like, oh, like what are those insects the bird's eating, or what tree is that the bird is in? Because people are telling me to look at this tree, and I don't know what tree that is. Um, I would say just, you know, start with what interests you, and once you start learning about that thing, you'll kind of like, you know, you will inevitably start reading about, or you know, looking at what it's interacting with, and then you can kind of move from there. And just kind of stop and slow down. Because I used to especially, you know, just want to look for snakes, and so I thought, okay, I cover more ground and maybe I can find something. But sometimes, not only with snakes, but just everything else, just stopping and like really paying attention to the sounds around you, to what's moving. Like look at a flower and see what's on it, because there's a lot that we miss. Would be kind of two of my first kind of pieces of advice. Ken-ichi?
I was going to say that, but I guess I'll say something different. Thinking about what, you know, what you actually like versus what you think you should like or should be doing. I would advise like trying different kinds of interactions and different kinds of senses. You know, if you go on a bird walk and you're like, man, I don't need to know the names of 80 birds. If that bums you out, like go on a nature journaling thing and just like sit in one place and draw for 2 hours and see how that feels. And if you don't like that and you're like, actually, maybe birds are cool, I just don't need all know their name. Like you go on like a bird audio thing where like you like learn to identify birds by their sounds, or try a different kind of organism or place or practice. Maybe you like fishing, you know, maybe the way that you interact with nature is you eat it. So that's, you know, another way that you could try things out. There's just so many ways of interacting with the natural world. I know like myself and Tony have a particular kind of practice where we go out and take pictures of things and then try to identify them. But that's really a narrow slice. There's so many other ways of being outside.
Thank you. Cool. Let's see. Melissa, you had another question, I think, where it was, do you want to unmute and ask your question? I think about salmon.
Yeah, I'm just progressively going through the questions I sent to you.
It works. It's good.
Like we're going, I'm letting other people talk, and then I'm sending another in.
I appreciate it.
My sister's really into marine biology, and I was wondering if you know any like California-based societies or places that are doing fish conservation.
Not specifically for fish. I do feel like I should mention the Calacademy like long-term intertidal monitoring project out at Pillar Point. They go out most low tides with a group and count things essentially. It's a great excuse to get on the coast for one thing, but also it's a good way to learn about different kinds of organisms, including fish. There are certainly fish there, but I'd say they're more invertebrate focused.
There's a group in Marin called it's called Spawn. It's an acronym for whatever makes an acronym for Spawn. And they do work with salmon in Marin. I looked at their website earlier today, and like it looks like they have at least some volunteer opportunities. I don't know exactly how extensive they are, but I think if you contact them, they might be able to, you know, if it doesn't work out with them, they might be able to tell you about other similar organizations as well.
Awesome. Thank you for those recommendations and for your question, Melissa. Oh yeah, and then C. Gleason in the chat had a recommendation. Do you want to unmute and mention that recommendation, C. Gleason?
Oh, yeah, my name is Craig.
Okay, Craig.
So yeah, just to the previous point about birds, I found that I'd been using the Merlin Bird application for quite a while, but more from the point of view of sort of putting in the description and trying to figure out what I was seeing. But once I installed the sound pack, I realized that it really helps to understand what's there without necessarily even observing it, right? It'll just listen and tell you what's around you. And that sort of leads you into figuring out, then you can look up that bird and understand more about it. I found that really helpful.
It's a. Oh. I'm sorry, Craig.
No, go ahead. I had a question that I had asked before, and I was going to go on to that, but go ahead.
I was just going to say Merlin is a pretty awesome app. It's made by the folks at Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and yeah, basically it records sounds and looks at the spectrograms and basically tries to identify the spectrogram of the sound that you're hearing and tell you what bird it is. And it's pretty awesome to walk around and just see like it tell you what it is, and then like that bird light up every time you hear it. So it's like a really good like visual, like, okay, that's the name, and I'm hearing it at the same time, and the app is flashing. So it's awesome. And and birds are hard, especially if you don't have any kind of equipment. And so I think it can really democratize birding. It's not always right, but in California, it's been right almost all the time, at least in my experience.
Yeah, can I ask the question that I put in the chat there? So
yeah,
I'm in Los Gatos, I'm on the Parks Commission, and we have a street tree list that's probably 30 plus years old. And I think it's basically worked out based on purely practical considerations. So it doesn't have any sort of sensitivity to what's native and what's not, or what supports biodiversity or not. And we want to update it, but I'm just wondering if there are any best practices or strategies that have worked well. For example, I saw that San Francisco, I think, has a pretty up-to-date street tree list, and it does take biodiversity into account. But I'm wondering if there are other things that we should look at in terms of really updating this so that we take the best approach for both practical considerations. What will actually work, what will grow in these compacted soils and where you have to worry about sidewalks and damage to roads and so forth. But you also want to make the best choices for biodiversity.
If only I was an urban planner. I'd say like consulting other cities is probably a great place to start. I mean, San Francisco would be a good reference point, although not exactly ecologically identical to Los Gatos. But yeah, all those concerns that you're thinking about are kind of where you want to start filtering your lists, right? Another major practical concern is just availability, right? What kind of species you can get from nurseries, who's growing what, on top of things like, water usage. So there's lots to consider there. It's a tough, it's a tough problem.
Just don't get whatever tree hosts those aphids that are spewing sticky things all over my car.
You want to discourage drivers, Tony. I think more of those trees.
That's true. That's true.
cool. Thank you for your question, Craig. And let's see. One question I had also was, when you're going out and observing, what's a tool that has changed the way you're able to see nature, like a microscope, or not a microscope, like a handheld lens or something? Like, what's something you would recommend a beginner consider? Something that's accessible for beginners, but that has definitely helped you in your nature experience.
Hands down for me, and would be a macro lens of some kind. You can get really cheap clip-on ones for your phone, or some of the newer iPhones have pretty good macro capabilities already. But being able to see something in a way that you can with your normal eyes, especially all these kind of small things, it really allows you to appreciate them. And it made me want to go out and look at more things, because you start noticing all these details, like mothing. I remember the first time I went mothing with Ken-ichi, which is basically you put out a sheet and you put a light on it and you wait, and bugs come in, and you look at most moths and they're kind of brown and not particularly interesting. But even with not a great macro lens, you kind of are able to get close to them. You see like all the little scales on their wings, the tiny patterns, the way their face is constructed. It's just kind of, I was totally hooked after that. And if you want to get into photography, there are a lot of pretty cheap used macro lenses you can get for a camera that will be perfectly fine. Ken-ichi?
Comfy shoes.
Oh yeah.
Or interestingly, no shoes at all. That's also like a way to like radically slow yourself down, and in my case, get some more poison oak in a new place. But yeah, it does things that make you slower often will help you notice things in ways that you wouldn't before. Someone in the chat mentioned binoculars. I'm going to add on to that and just say close focus binoculars I find are really useful for a lot of different things. For like the regular things you use binoculars for to see things that are far away, but close focus binoculars can also function as kind of almost like a mini dissecting scope, because you can focus on things like a meter away from you and get really close details. So it can be another fun way of looking at small things like bugs and snails or details on plants.
I would say for me also just I used to hike in jeans, and I don't know why I did, because I couldn't walk very well. So it did slow me down, but I was uncomfortable the whole time. So like loose hiking pants and yeah, comfy shoes make a huge difference.
Or whatever's comfy for you, or whatever makes you feel comfortable. Some folks want to look a certain way to feel comfortable, and that's great too. I love seeing cool trail style outside. So.
Thank you. That sounds, yeah, sounds really cool. And for the recommendations, thank you. For one question I had was, what are some interesting behaviors you've seen between animals of different species when you've been out observing, or something that's just memorable, notable, just kind of caught your eye and you still remember it to this day?
One of my favorites was Ken-ichi and I and some other people were at Pepperwood Preserve helping someone who was doing a reptile amphibian survey, and so they laid out some boards and we were kind of flipping those and seeing, you know, which reptiles and amphibians were under them. And I saw a small, I believe it was a California newt, extremely toxic, and it started walking, and a Pacific tree frog tried to eat it. So it stuck its tongue out, grabbed the newt briefly, and then let it go. And then the frog's tongue was stuck out for maybe a minute or two because it had probably been numbed by the toxin in this newt. I don't think they're a natural predator. There's some garter snakes and other animals that'll eat these newts, but that's about it. So that was really, really fun and not something I expected to see.
I'm always amazed by all the pictures of birds eating fish that you take, Tony.
Yeah. Most of my fish observations on iNat are of fish in bird's mouth. Oh man, I'm trying to think now.
I don't know about interactions. I feel like I'm always happy to see an interaction of some kind, or if I can like document it well, but can I remember any specific ones? I'm not so sure.
Going this way, right?
One of my favorites
Let me
is
finish this.
I'm continually surprised by this.
This is, yeah, no, it's
Run a Zoom?
I'll see like a fly or bee on a flower and I'll be creeping up on it and it's not moving. I'm just like, this is incredible. I'm gonna get the most amazing shot. I am like the sneakiest person, and you look closer and it's a crab spider that's been waiting on the flower that has, you know, envenomated the bee, and which is always kind of cool to see. And I remember I grew up always wanting to see crab spiders, and Ken-ichi's like, they're everywhere, and they are. So just, you know, stop and look at flowers and you'll see them, and they're beautiful and just awesome.
So cool. Thank you for sharing. That's awesome. Melissa, you entered another question. What would you like to unmute and ask?
I told you I told you I had 6 questions that I had sent before, but yeah, migratory species besides birds and whales, if you know any.
Dragonflies, some of them.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Wandering gliders are migratory and will pass through. I think you'll often see them in the summer. I used to live near Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, and they were definitely like show up kind of late summer, fall, and not be there at other times.
I remember being near the top of Mount Diablo in August one year, and there were just hundreds and hundreds over our heads. Just phenomenal.
Yeah, oftentimes at like high passes in the Bay Area, that you'll see aggregations of dragonflies.
Oh, man, now I'm thinking about other ones.
Bats, I think some bats are migratory. I hate to, I know you said no birds, but like poor wills, if you've never seen a poor will, those are migratory, and it's such a great, cool bird that most people never get to see because they're out at night. Um, but a very strange bird that you can see if you go on night hikes and shine your flashlight down the trail and look for the eye shine.
And even if if you kind of expand migratory to like short migrations, there's the tarantula migrations, there are like newt migrations when it's raining. Spadefoot toads in some areas, which are these really weird tiny toads, or not toads, but frog toady things that with like vertical pupils, and they come out very briefly to breed.
Awesome. Cool. Let's see. Maybe as a final question, as we're kind of wrapping up, let's see. I would ask if you had a free afternoon and you wanted to plan a nature outing, and it was just going to be like the ideal outing for you, whatever that means. What would it look like, and what would you be doing? What would you be looking for? Would you be with other people? Would you be alone? Where would you be in the Bay Area?
Wow. Does it have to be the afternoon?
No, it can be anytime. Anytime.
Things get hot and the light gets bad in the afternoon. I think in general, I would want to be around some people I know, some friends. Although sometimes it's nice to be out and alone and not, even though I have friends who wouldn't, be rushing me or something, just being by yourself and not feeling any sort of social obligation can be really, really, fun. I don't know. I think honestly, like I love going to Mount Diablo. I think most days I would like to explore that, especially if it's in the spring or fall or almost any time of year. And going on maybe 5 to 6 mile hike that takes me through a few different habitats, and that I can just kind of stop and look at things.
I'd say what I was doing this past Saturday morning at dawn, standing in a tide pool near Pescadero, surrounded by slugs and friends, was kind of an ideal, both slug friends and human friends, pretty ideal nature experience for me. If I literally just had an afternoon, I live in Oakland, so I'd probably head out to somewhere in the Oakland Hills and go for a hike in whatever seemed like the most native planty area I could think of for that time of the year. So honestly, I could probably find some kind of solace in almost any outdoor trip.
Thank you. I think Melissa had asked Tony when you were talking about Mount Diablo if there was any particular place on Mount Diablo.
Not really. It just kind of depends on kind of time of year and what kind of mood you're in. I think Mitchell Canyon is a great place to start because you can do a pretty flat hike for most of it and still see some amazing things. A few weeks ago, I kind of went around in a circle around the peak. It was really hot. I don't know if I'd recommend it, but around North Peak and up toward Deer Flat and that whole area, there were some really cool plants still. And almost anywhere on that mountain is going to be pretty awesome. You can't really go wrong.
Thank you so much. And I think that we can call it there. I really appreciate you both for joining us this evening, and for everyone else on the call for joining and spending the evening hour with us. And yeah, I think we're hoping to do these sorts of events somewhat regularly. So please just stay tuned. We'll have more of these to come. And thank you for joining. And if you have any feedback or follow up, just feel free to email me. And yeah, thank you all for joining.
Yes, thanks, guys.